This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. It's great to have you guys on the show today, as always. Before we get into our conversation today, I have to encourage you to go over to the Libertarian Christian Institute's website at libertarianchristians.com and donate to our cause. I know that you love this show. I know that you love the content that I produce, and there are a lot of other great podcasts that are produced by the Libertarian Christian Institute, many of which I'm sure you are familiar with. And the thing about it is that all of these podcasts cost money to produce, and having the institute and all of the website and everything else, it all costs money. People have to get paid in order to provide services. We know that, right? Because we're good free marketers. So go over to the Libertarian Christian Institute's website. On the top right-hand corner of the page, there is a button, a tab that says donate. You can become a Libertarian Christian insider. So there is a lot of information there about how to be an insider. You get special perks. You give at certain levels over a certain period of time. Or if you don't want to go that route, which I suggest you do, but if you don't want to and you'd rather just donate, give us a little bit, you can do that as well. So we would appreciate any and all donations. So if you could, go over to libertarianchristians.com and donate. All right. Well, we got some stuff we got to talk about on the show today. So there are a couple of very important passages at the end of the letter to Timothy, 1 Timothy, that I think have a lot of significant consequences for the way that we reflect on the Bible and economics. So again, this is going to be coming out of 1 Timothy 5 through 6 today, and these are very rich passages that have a lot to say about how we need to conceptualize charity, how we should conceptualize wealth and the moral value of wealth and the responsibilities that come from having wealth. And then also the reasons why many people assume that the Bible teaches socialism. So before we even get into the passage, though, I have to make the point that I've made a lot of times on this show, that when I talk about the Bible and economics, and when I go through some of these passages in the Bible that seem to be laying out a particular way of thinking about economics, I am not making a positive case for capitalism, because I don't think that the Bible teaches capitalism at all. In fact, I don't think that the Bible teaches anything about modern economics, because economics is a modern discipline. And I don't think that the way that we understand economics as kind of this intellectual or academic discipline in the modern world has anything to do with the way that people thought about economics in antiquity. In fact, it's probably anachronistic even to think that they had an economics sort of reflection that we have in the modern world today. So the way that we conceptualize economics is not represented in any ancient thought categories. It's just not fair for us to import this modern conception of economics back into antiquity. And both conservative Christians and progressive Christians are guilty of this. They go to the Bible, and even a lot of libertarian Christians, I think, are guilty of this. They go to the Bible looking for passages that justify their contemporary economic views, and that's just not legitimate, because the writers of the Bible aren't living in a world where they reflect on economics in the same way that we do today. And so all attempts to try to make the Bible fit into one of our contemporary economic schemes it's doomed to failure, basically from the start, because again, there's just no way that the people in antiquity were thinking like this. And this has always been the problem that I've had, like with Answers in Genesis and like the fundamentalist six-day creation kind of arguments. And really, this was summed up like so beautifully about 10 years ago in a debate between Ken Ham, who is the founder and the CEO, I guess, of Answers in Genesis, which is an organization that's dedicated to promoting young earth creationism. He had a debate with Bill Nye, the science guy, on Genesis 1 and whether or not it conformed to the scientific record, at least the scientific record that most biologists and geologists would affirm today. As they were going through the debate, people predictably lined up on either side. The conservative fundamentalists thought that Ken Ham won the debate, and the kind of the more liberal progressives thought that Bill Nye had won the debate. But that wasn't my perspective on it at all. In fact, my perspective was that they had both lost the debate, because not once over the course of that debate did either Ken Ham or Bill Nye ask what the writers of the Bible could have possibly been trying to communicate in Genesis chapter 1 and 2. They just assumed that Genesis chapter 1 and 2 was designed to answer modern scientific questions, which is just not. Like, they didn't think that way in the ancient world, and it's not fair for us to impose our modern sensibilities, our modern worldview on these ancient texts. And if it's illegitimate to do that with science, then it's also illegitimate to do that with economics. So today I'm not making a positive case for capitalism. What I am making is a negative case against socialism. I don't believe, contrary to popular Christian thinking in the modern world, that the Bible teaches anything that could be tangentially related to socialism whatsoever. And I think that 1 Timothy 5-6 is an excellent example of how we often try to interpret the Bible through our modern economic frameworks. And this is these are passages that progressives often go to suggest, especially in 1 Timothy 6, that the Bible teaches a form of socialism. And that's just not the case. So we're going to get into that today. And again, I always have to frame that. I'm not trying to impose or import my understanding of capitalism on the Bible. I don't need the Bible to affirm capitalism. The Bible's not designed to do that. That's not the kind of information that the writers of the Bible are trying to give us. And they didn't think about it in a systematic way like we do in antiquity. So it's not fair for us to do that. So now that we got that out of the way, there's another objection, a common objection that people might have. 1 and 2 Timothy are in the Bible, but there are many New Testament scholars that do not consider 1 and 2 Timothy to be authentically Pauline. So there is a lot of debate within New Testament scholarship about which, in Pauline scholarship in particular, about which books were actually written by Paul and which books were not. Now, I am someone who's pretty traditional. I think that all of the books that are attributed to Paul in the New Testament, and I really think that all of the literature that is attributed to all of the various writers in the New Testament actually legitimately go back to those writers. Now, 1 and 2 Timothy are books that I would say there are a small minority of scholars that affirm their Pauline authenticity. So it's not a mainstream position to think that 1 and 2 Timothy were genuinely written by Paul. And there are a lot of objections out there, and you can pick up a commentary and see all of the objections to the authorship by Paul of 1 and 2 Timothy. They often have to do with the perceived differences in language and style and content from other Pauline literature. But I've always been skeptical of this because we don't have a lot of source information about the ancient world. And based on what we know about the way that ancient texts were produced, especially ancient letters, some of these letters would have been written by a scribe who might have had a very free hand over what was included in the letter. And then the attributed author, like Paul, might have proofread it. And if everything that the scribe had written out corresponded to the thought of the person who was having the letter produced, then they'd be good to go. And I also think that people's writing styles change over time. And especially if you have someone like Paul is very good, I think uniquely good among ancient letter writers of tailoring his message to his particular audience. Again, one of his theological principles in 1 Corinthians 9 is that Paul says that he can become all things to all people. And so he knows how to tailor an argument to his specific audience. And I really like what James Dunn says about Paul, the late, great New Testament scholar James Dunn. He says that Paul is not really a theologian. He's a theologizer, or which I don't know if that's the right way to pronounce it, right? But basically the point that he's making is that Paul might not be as systematic as we think he is, and instead a lot of Paul's arguments and a lot of Paul's rhetoric in his letters are designed to meet the very specific needs of the community to which he's addressing. And if you look at 1 and 2 Timothy as letters that are written specifically to an individual person instead of being general letters that were written to a church like Romans or Corinthians, then it would make sense that the language and the style and the content would be different than Paul's other letters. I just don't understand that. And I also think that there's been this inherent tendency since the Enlightenment to cast doubt on the authenticity or the veracity of the Bible. And I think you can go back and look at a lot of Enlightenment critics of Christianity, and they're actually not very good biblical scholars. And a lot of them criticize the Bible in a way. The point of why these Enlightenment thinkers are criticizing the Bible is not because they have actual historical objections to the material that they find in there. It's because they want to challenge the power of the church. And in fact, when we teach when I teach this unit in my class on the Enlightenment, I talk to my students about this exact problem with the Enlightenment. There are not a lot of people in the Enlightenment that are actually very deep, critical, historical thinkers when it comes to the Bible. They might actually be very profound. They might have a very profound and nuanced historical mind, but then for whatever reason, when they get to the Bible, they treat those texts as if they're somehow historically different from all of the other documents that were produced in antiquity, which doesn't make any sense at all. But the problem with these Enlightenment thinkers is that they're skeptical of the power of the church, and honestly, coming out of the late Middle Ages, that's rightly so. And I think that biblical scholarship from the beginning has always had this kind of inherent bias against the Bible being true. And I think that you can see within evangelicalism and with evangelical circles, the reaction has always been to kind of overstate the case for our ability to positively understand the Bible. When in reality, the Bible is a collection of historical documents that I do believe are absolutely authoritative, but there are a lot of historical questions, some of which we might never be able to resolve. And that's just okay. And then when you take a look at the way that some progressives have tried to either legitimize or delegitimize the authorship of a particular text. One of my favorite bad examples of this is a book called The First Paul that was written by John Dominic Crossan and Marcus Borg back in the day. I think the book's probably like 20 years old at this point, but they choose to attribute Pauline authorship to all of the books in the New Testament or all the letters in the New Testament that happen to conform to their modern view of racial and class-based and race-based issues. So in other words, all of the Pauline letters that have language that could be easily applicable to modern progressive sensibilities about class, race, and gender are authentically Pauline, and those like 1st and 2nd Timothy that are a little bit more difficult to conform to our modern liberal sensibilities about those issues are authentically Pauline. So it's just funny how subjective a lot of the approaches these scholars have to the authenticity of certain works of the book, certain works in the New Testament truly are. And if you want a good example of why I think that 1st and 2nd Timothy can be considered legitimately Pauline on historical grounds, I had an episode a couple of months ago with Benjamin Laird, who is a professor at Liberty University, who has a really excellent book on this. And I'll put links to that in the show notes so you can go back and take a look at this. But we're going to look at first. So all of that is to say, I know that was a lot of background information, but we have to frame this conversation both philosophically and historically, just to make sure that if you're listening and maybe you're a new listener to the show, you understand that I am not trying to impose my capitalist worldview onto the New Testament. And I think in a lot of ways, historians, and this is just one of the problems with studying history in general. It's something that we really can't escape, is that we are deeply subjective human beings, and we tend to read everything in history through our modern lens. And unless you start out with the assumption that those in the past did not share our worldview, then you're always going to wind up actually just making the past conform to your modern sensibilities. And I'm trying very hard not to do that here. So I wanted to frame that part of this conversation before we go on. So also, before we do this, we also need to take a look at exactly what is going on in the historical background. So 1st and 2nd Timothy were written by Paul to Timothy, who was a leader at the church in Ephesus. But there's a very interesting story of Paul's time in Ephesus in Acts chapter 19. And I think that background information might shed a little bit of light on exactly why Paul needed to write to Timothy in the first place, because he's dealing with several problems in 1st and 2nd Timothy. But I think that the maybe quasi-precarious position of the church might be a major motivating factor for Paul. So in Acts 19, we have Paul making it to the city of Ephesus. Ephesus is, of course, a city that is on the coast of Western Asia Minor on the Aegean Sea, a very famous city which was the home to the shrine of Artemis. And Artemis is the goddess of the moon, women, and slaves, and the Romans would have referred to her as Diana. So Artemis Diana, the same goddess there, the goddess of the moon, women, and slaves, and she has a great shrine in Ephesus. So Paul lands in Ephesus, and he's there for, according to Acts 19:10, he's there for 2 years, and he's incredibly successful. There are a lot of people that wind up, both Jews and Greeks, that wind up believing in the gospel, and that wind up following Paul, and that wind up participating in the church. So he's incredibly successful in his time at Ephesus. But towards the end of his 2-year stay in Ephesus, and this is recounted in Acts 19:23 to 41, there there is a man named Demetrius, who is a craftsman who makes little shrines of this goddess Artemis. And that's a very large part of the economy of Ephesus. And he is concerned, and I think that we can understand from like a market-driven perspective why he might be concerned, that so many people are not worshiping Artemis, but instead worshiping Jesus. And so he kind of creates this giant commotion, and they almost create a riot. And fortunately, the leaders of the city step in and say that Paul and his friends aren't really doing anything that's harmful. They're not trying to shut down Demetrius's business. They're not trying to do any of that kind of stuff like that. But still, in Ephesus, after that point, the church is going to have to be very careful about its reputation. And we're going to see in 1 Timothy, Paul tries really hard to encourage Timothy to be the leader that church in Ephesus needs. So let's take a look at the background of 1 Timothy. So obviously in 1 Timothy, Paul is writing to Timothy, who is in charge of the church at Ephesus in Paul's absence. And it's very important that Paul writes to Timothy because he wants to see the church in Ephesus, which he had been a part of growing for 2 years. He wants to see the church in Ephesus succeed. So the first couple of passages, or the first couple of sentences in 1 Timothy explain the background and Paul's motive for writing 1 Timothy. And he says this: Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, according to the commandment of God our Savior, and of Christ Jesus, who is our hope. To Timothy, my true child in the faith, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ Jesus our Lord. As I urged you upon my departure from Macedonia, remain on at Ephesus so that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, nor to pay attention to myths and endless genealogies which give rise to mere speculation rather than furthering the administration of God, which is by faith. So there are people in Ephesus that are teaching strange doctrines, that are not teaching doctrines that are in accordance with the gospel and in accordance with Paul's preaching, and it's up to Timothy to set the record straight for these false leaders, that Timothy has to continue to proclaim the true gospel there. And Paul makes this point, and this is really, really important in chapter 1, verse 5, he says, but the goal of our instruction is to love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. And so one of the goals that Paul hopes will be accomplished by the proclamation of his true instruction of the gospel of Jesus is that Christians will learn to love from a pure heart and a good conscience and a sincere faith. So there is this built into it, this idea that Christians, when they are properly instructed, will love other people, and they will be willing to do that from a pure heart and a good conscience. And again, he kind of makes overtures to his overarching point in 1 Timothy 3:15 as well, where Paul says this: I write to you so that you will know how one ought to conduct himself in the household of God, which is the church of the living God, the pillar and support of the truth. So Paul's purpose is to encourage Timothy to be a good leader, to counter the teachings, the false teachings of these teachers that are teaching strange doctrines, and also to encourage the church and Timothy as a leader in the church to conform to the lifestyle that results from his faith, which has to do fundamentally with loving other people and conducting yourself appropriately. And this is really, really important for our conversation on 1 Timothy 5 and 6 and Paul's understanding of these kind of economic, what we would label in the modern world economic problems. Okay, so when Paul talks about love, I think the main passages that we should look at, the Philippians chapter 2, obviously, where Paul says, and he does frame this with respect to love, but he says that Christians need to have the attitude of Christ. And that attitude of Christ is this willingness to sacrifice for other people, to make personal, self-emptying sacrifices for the sake of others. And this is the kind of model of Paul's lifestyle that he lives out over and over and over again throughout his ministry, that Paul is willing to make sacrifices for the sake of other people. And this is cruciformity. Jesus's cross is the ultimate example of what true love and self-sacrifice looks like. And so when Christians want to understand love, they have to understand it through the lens of the cross. There's no other way to explain that. And in fact, I did an episode a long time ago on 1 John where I talked about what love actually means in the Bible. And it's not this kind of emotional feeling savings-oriented way of understanding it that we have in the modern world. For the writers of the Bible, loving other people means self-sacrifice. It means making sacrifices yourself to benefit somebody else. And this is the goal of Christian instruction, is to make Christians more loving towards other people, because this is what conforms to the cross. Jesus is our example of how we ought to live our life. It's that willingness to sacrifice for people that don't necessarily deserve it. And that is what Paul is writing Timothy to encourage him to do. Now, this has a lot to do with our negative case against socialism, because the reality of, we've talked about the definitions of capitalism and socialism a lot on this show, but we need to do it again just because it's always important to frame how these concepts work. The basic Econ 101 definition of capitalism and socialism is very simple. Capitalism is an economic system, or in reality, a lack of an economic system, where the factors of production are privately owned and there's no central planning of the economy. So consumers and producers get to decide what they're going to buy and what they're going to produce, and there's no kind of central coordinating planning board that's directing the economy in any particular direction. That's all that capitalism is. It's a decentralized, really anti-system of economics. It just allows people to control the means of production and to provide whatever the market wants to provide, and consumers can purchase whatever goods they want at a price they're willing to pay. That's all that capitalism is. Socialism is simply the opposite of that. Socialism is when the means of production are owned by a collective, and in every situation, every instance of socialism is always that the means of production are owned by the government, and that there is economic central planning, that there are people that are trying to direct the orientation or to direct the course of the economy in a particular way. What Paul is going to be doing in his book when he talks about the role of widows and the role of wealth, which are the two big issues that he deals with in 1 Timothy 5 and 6, is that he is not advocating at all that the government needs to seize the means of production and that the government needs to distribute welfare to those that are in need. Paul couldn't advocate for that, because that doesn't have anything to do with Christians sacrificially giving up things for the sake of other people. That doesn't have anything to do with that at all. And the problem with socialism philosophically is that the government doesn't actually produce anything. So if the government owns them and controls the means of production, the only way that they can acquire the funds or acquire the means to do that is if they take from private owners. And in the case of the United States, we very much are a socialist country already. Like, the government regulates every aspect of the economy. We do not have a free market in the United States. And I think it's really important for people to remember that. And the problem with like socialism in the American sense is that the only way that the government can provide like charity, because we're going to talk about welfare here in a couple minutes, because I think it's a really important concept that's often brought into these texts here that are just not justified in any way by the text. But when it comes to socialism, the government forces you by law to give up a certain amount of your income so that they can use it to benefit the people that they think need the most help. And the only way that they can generate this revenue is by quite literally pointing a gun at your head and saying that you have to pay up. Now, one of the great examples that I always try to give of this is that imagine for a moment. So the government takes about 30% of the average American adult's income. And I think you could even, once you factor in like vehicle taxes and all of those kind of other things, I think the number is actually a lot higher. The government takes quite a bit of the money that we make from productivity. And let's say that you get fed up with the fact that the government uses about half of that money, at least the federal government does. They use about half that money to bomb innocent people in countries overseas that are of no strategic threat to the United States in any way. And you decide that you're going to stop paying that portion of your taxes. You're like, you can take my 15-20% for the welfare state and for the roads and all of that kind of stuff, but you're not going to take the rest of this to bomb innocent women and children overseas. What is the government going to do? They're going to come and they're going to take your house and they're going to separate you from your family, and they're going to throw you in prison. That's how taxation works. And that's the only way within socialism that the government, that the central planners can get the resources that they need to implement their vision of society. And I think that is completely antithetical to what Paul is arguing for in 1 Timothy. Again, the idea behind Paul's instruction as a Christian is that we are to love from a sincere heart, which means that we as individual Christians have to be motivated to give up our resources for the sake of other people. There's no one putting a gun to our head or any of that stuff in order to help those that are in need. That's just not the way that this works. And the trap that a lot of progressive Christians fall into is they wind up supporting those government policies that can only be implemented by putting a gun to somebody else's head and saying, give me your money, because this is going to be for the betterment of society. That's what happens in any of these socialist systems. And it's very important that we understand that. There's no other way. The government only takes that money from people, only takes those resources from people because they have a monopoly on violence. And so, and really what this all comes down to is that under socialism, you are making somebody else sacrifice to implement your vision of society. People are not voluntarily sacrificing. People are not being cruciform in their sacrificiality. You're making somebody else give up something that they might not want to give up to further implement your vision of society. I can't think of a more backwards way of understanding what Paul is saying in 1st and 2nd Timothy than this. So we frame this out where Paul is dealing with problems that are arising in the Ephesian church. And you have to understand that based on Acts 19, it's probably pretty precarious for a lot of Ephesians there. There are going to be social tensions and social conflicts there in Ephesus. And Paul is hoping that by addressing these problems to Timothy, his leader there, that the Christians in Ephesus will, as Paul says, love from a pure heart and know how they ought to conduct themselves in the household of God. So this is going to get us to chapter 5. And in chapter 5, Paul deals with a very interesting issue of supporting widows who don't have anyone to support themselves. So I'm going to read the entire passage, which is 1 Timothy 5, that's 3 through 16, and then we're going to break it down. And I'm going to try to explain why I think this passage is so important and why I think a lot of progressive Christians in particular misunderstand what Paul is trying to accomplish here. So he says this, he says, honor widows who are widows indeed, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. Now she who is a widow indeed and who has been left alone has fixed her hope on God and continues in entreaties and prayers night and day. But she who gives herself to wanton pleasure is dead even while she lives. Prescribe these things as well, so that they may be above reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his household, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. A widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old, having been the wife of one man, having a reputation for good works, and if she has brought up children, if she has shown hospitality to strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has assisted those in distress, and if she has devoted herself to every good work. But refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires in disregard of Christ, they want to get married, thus incurring condemnation because they have set aside their previous pledge. At the same time, they also learn to be idle, and as they go around from house to house, and not merely idle, but also gossips and busybodies, talking about things not proper to mention. Therefore, I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep house, and give the enemy no occasion for reproach, for some have already turned aside to follow Satan. If any woman who is a believer has dependent widows, she must assist them, and the church must not be burdened, so that it may assist those who are widows indeed. So that is the passage as a whole. And I think that there are a lot of people, again, who read the Bible through the modern economic framework of either socialism, Keynesianism, or capitalism, that draw the conclusion that because Paul is concerned about widows, which has deeply biblical roots, going back to like Deuteronomy 10, and there are plenty of places in the Old Testament where God explicitly affirms that we need to care for those that are in need, in particular widows and orphans. So there is deep biblical justification for that, but they take what Paul says here about supporting widows, and then they immediately jump to the conclusion that the United States federal government ought to have a monopoly on supporting widows, which isn't justified by the text. And I want to break this down because there's some really, really interesting things going on in this passage that I think we need to address. So the first thing that we need to understand here is that in the ancient world, widows that don't have family members are in a very difficult situation because generally women had very limited employment options. This isn't true for everybody, but women have much fewer employment options in antiquity than they do in the modern world, and there are wide societal expectations that keep women at the home raising kids. And again, some of this, not even some of this, a lot of this just has to do with the technology that they had available at the time. Most of the jobs in antiquity required some sort of muscular work, and you can't just go down to the store and buy baby formula. And there's not running water in a lot of cases. You might, maybe in Ephesus and some of the Roman cities, they had aqueducts and houses could get Roman water. So maybe that wouldn't have been a problem there, but you definitely don't have access to all of the medical care that you have today. And so for a lot of women, they literally have to spend their entire day taking care of their children, or else their children will die. They have to make sure that their children are fed. They have to make sure that the house is taken care of. They have to make sure that their children are kept safe, because if not, these kids die. And there are very high infant mortality rates in the ancient world, and really even high like early childhood mortality rates in antiquity, rates that are much higher than we have in the modern world, because they just didn't have the technology to keep children safe. And so women had to start having kids early, because if you wanted to have enough kids to continue on the human species, you'd have to acknowledge that a lot of these kids are just not going to make it into adulthood. That's just the cold, hard reality of life in antiquity. And I think that we are so privileged in the modern world to have hospitals and to have, all like it's not easy being a woman. It's really not. I mean, I'm married to one and I have a daughter, so I get it. It's not easy being a woman, but with all of the technology that we have now, it's a lot easier in the modern world than it is for women in the ancient world. And so there is just this kind of natural and in a lot of ways, inevitable. There's just this like inevitable scenario or situation where women have to, for the most part, take care of their kids. And so if a woman winds up in a situation where her husband, who is often going to be the breadwinner, dies, then they're going to be in real deep trouble. And in fact, Augustus, the first Roman Empire, or the first Roman emperor, rather, he passed a set of laws called the Laws of Augustus that were designed to try to address a lot of these family problems. Because in ancient Rome, it is truly patriarchal in the sense that they had this system called the paterfamilias system, where the father was the ultimate authority in the household. And what Augustus understood is that if you wanted to have a strong empire, if you wanted Rome to be strong, then you had to make sure that you started out with strong families. And so Augustus, in his Laws of Augustus, tried to address this problem of widowhood, because widowhood would have created a lot of women that did not have anyone to support them. And so here's what Augustus said. It said, legislate, and this is from a book called The Greco-Roman World of the New Testament by James Jeffers, great background book on a lot of these issues in the New Testament. And here's what he says about this. He says, legislation by the Emperor Caesar Augustus, however, required every woman between 20 and 50 to be married or lose her rights of inheritance and other privileges. Augustus was seeking to stem the tide of childless aristocrats that threatened many old aristocratic families with extinction. Those who were widowed or divorced were to remarry and bear children. So under Roman law, during this time, there were lots of incentives for widows to get remarried. They might lose out on their inheritance and other financial benefits if they did not get remarried. And Augustus did this because he thought that it would benefit society. And Paul has to deal with this problem in 1 Timothy, because it has, obviously, he's devoted almost an entire chapter to it, over half a chapter at least. And so the problem of widows in the church is a very significant problem for Paul. But what's really interesting here, okay, verse 3 and 4, he says, honor widows who are widows indeed, but if any widow has children or grandchildren, they must first learn to practice piety in regard to their own family and to make some return to their parents, for this is acceptable in the sight of God. And so when Paul thinks about who should support these widows, it's first and foremost their family. So if a widow's husband dies and they have children that have the means to support the widow, then those children need to be responsible and take care of their widowed mom. That's it. And that is nothing like the conception of taking care of widows and orphans that we see from modern American Christians who believe in the welfare state. Because for a lot of progressive Christians, they don't think that the first line of defense against things like orphans and widows is for individuals, family members, to help those that are in need within their own family. Instead, what they say is that the government needs to come in as the monopoly provider of charity and take care of those needs for them. But that is completely contradictory to what Paul says in 1 Timothy 5, verse 4. Completely contradicts that mentality. If you have a family member who is in need and you do not help them out, That is a problem. And you're supposed to go to that family member first. And again, Paul's not saying that this problem of widowhood isn't a significant problem. It absolutely is. And women could be easily left destitute if it wasn't for their the support of their family members in this situation. And so because Paul cares about it so much, he says, look, if there's a widow and she has family members that can take care of her, they need to do that. And then in verse 8, what he says in verse 8 is even sharper. He says, but if anyone does not provide for his own, and especially for those of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So here's my point. We have a lot of progressive Christians in the United States today that want the government to be the monopoly provider of charity. But how many of those progressive Christians would financially support family members that were sick or widowed or that were in need of help? I don't know. I think that there are a lot of very good progressive Christians out there that probably are very generous and that probably would give. But Paul's model here is not that we should seek for the government to take money from other people and give it to groups of people that they perceive have more need. That's not the model here. Paul's not saying that the government of Ephesus or the Roman Empire should pass a law where they raise everyone's taxes to take care of the widows in the church. He says if the widows have family members, then those family members need to take care of the widows. It's not the government. It's not somebody else's responsibility. If there's someone that has a need, then you need to take care of that need, especially if they are a member of your family. It's that simple. It's really that simple. And it's amazing to me that Paul says that if you don't take care of your family members when they are in need, if you try to outsource that care to the church, or if you try to outsource that care, he doesn't say the government here, but if you try to outsource that care, if you have no desire to take care of your family members, then you have denied the faith and you're worse than an unbeliever. That's a really important point. That's a really important point. And that cuts against a lot of the modern conversations that we have about the Bible and economics. Because again, we just assume that the government should be there to provide charity, but this isn't Paul's model at all. The model that Paul has goes back to what he says in 1 verse 5 and 3 verse 15, chapter 1 verse 5 and chapter 3 verse 15, that the goal of Christian instruction is to love from a pure heart. That means to make sacrifices for other people, just like Jesus did on the cross for us, and to conduct yourself in a manner that is consistent with your faith. This says in 3:15, and this is what it looks like. If somebody's in need and you have the ability to solve that problem, then you should do it. You don't call up your politicians and say, hey, I need you to take money from people that have nice jobs and give it to these people that I feel need help. You feel like you help them yourself. If you think someone has a need, and especially if it's your family member, you help them. That's Paul's model here. The other thing that Paul says it's a little bit of like kind of like sacrificing a sacred cow is starting in verse 9 through 15. He outlines, so if widows are going to receive help from the church, financial help from the church, he outlines the qualifications that woman has to meet in order to be able to receive benefits or help from the church. So he says a widow is to be put on the list only if she is not less than 60 years old. And again, it's interesting that under Roman law, there were inheritance privileges that were lost if you were 50 and up to the age of 50 and didn't get married. It's very interesting that he has a time stamp on that there. But having a reputation for good works, bringing up children, showing hospitality to strangers, washing the saints' feet. And he also says, refuse to put younger widows on the list, for when they feel sensual desires, they will want to get married. So Paul is dealing with the reality that the church has limited resources and that those limited resources should go to those people that actually needed it. Widows that don't have family members to support them, and widows that actually live out the values that arise from their faith, that are actually following what Paul says his instructions are supposed to do in 1 Timothy 1:5 and 3:15, that women that actually live out their faith should be the ones that get that charity, because other people otherwise they will use and abuse the charity that is given to them. So this is a big point, and I think a big principle that comes from this is not only should we as individual Christians make personal sacrifices to benefit the people in our lives that need the most help, which is really important, but that not everybody deserves charity. Like there are some people that are more deserving of charity than others. And it's very much okay for us as Christians to say that if somebody's not trying to help themselves, and if somebody is living a very self-destructive life, that it is not a good use of our money to enable that bad behavior and just give it to them no matter what. And this is the problem with the government having a monopoly on welfare and with the government having a monopoly on charity, is that there is no distinction. There's no distinction between those that deserve it and those that don't. There are plenty of people that receive welfare benefits in the United States that don't deserve, that it could work. And in fact, the welfare system, honestly, in a lot of ways, kind of enables some of that really bad behavior. And I think a lot of times Keynesian and socialist Christians ignore it. I think that they have a good heart. I think that they believe that these policies, because these policies are designed to help the poor, they believe that it might actually be true. But in reality, we know that doesn't wind up happening. And so Thomas Sowell has that great book, Economic Facts and Fallacies, and then Amity Shlaes has a great book about the Great Society and the implementation of the welfare system in the United States. And both of them talk about the externalities, about all of the damage that is done to our society by taking from everybody and giving to a very large group of people. That oftentimes there are people that receive these benefits that don't actually need them, and that this might actually incentivize people to engage in more self-destructive behavior. And Paul, I think, is a lot wiser than that. Paul says that, yes, there are going to be people, these widows, that are going to be in need. And it's up to us as Christians to help them. And we have to have the wisdom to know who actually deserves this charity and who actually needs it and who are just grifting in order to not have to do a lot of work. And I think it's really important that we ask these questions. And these seem to be the questions that we're not allowed to ask. But we all know this. And we also know that anyone that's listening to the show that is a parent inherently knows that when parents give their kids everything that they want, they pay for absolutely everything. Their kid asks for, new name brand clothing or, whatever, a brand new iPhone or whatever, that incentivizes those kids to stay at home for as long as possible. And we have a lot of people like that are my age that are still living with their parents, not because they couldn't afford to go out and work, but because they never had to. And that when you enable your kid, when there's no consequences and you give them whatever they want, then they're probably not going to grow up to be very productive people, and they're probably not going to grow up to be self-sufficient. And all of those things are valuable, right? Like you cannot help other people. Like you can't give to charity if you don't make anything yourself. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that it's just so important that we understand the principles that Paul lays out here, that it's up to us. If we are going to embody cruciform sacrificiality towards other people as Christians, then we have to give to those in our own lives that need it. And especially if it's our family members, like if a family member needs help and we have the means to help them, then we should do that, even if it means sacrificing our quality of life. Like life's not easy. I think that there are a lot of progressive Christians that want to have both their nice, comfortable, materialist, consumeristic lifestyle, but then they want to feel good that they are supporting policies that they think will help other people. It's like they want to have their cake and eat it too. Yes, I want these people that need help to be helped, but I don't want to actually give up anything of my own in order to help them out. I just want the government to take money from more productive people and give it to everyone that claims that they have a problem. And that system doesn't work with Paul. And chapter 5 is, I think, a really great takedown of that. Again, I'm not saying that chapter 5 here is advocating for free market capitalism. It's not. But it's also not advocating for socialism. And the principles that are outlined in 1 Timothy 5 are completely at odds with the Keynesian or socialist mentality in the modern era, and trying to read socialism or Keynesianism back into chapter 5 just doesn't work. And he lays out some very interesting principles there. So this leads us finally to chapter 6, which is one of the most interesting passages of all time in the New Testament, at least on wealth. And so again, one of the things that Paul is trying to do, as he said before in 1 Timothy, is to correct false teachers and to encourage Timothy to correct false teachers. So he gives us a little bit of a background here, and he says, if anyone advocates a different doctrine, this is chapter 6, verse 3. If anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and with the doctrine conforming to godliness, he is conceited and understands nothing, but he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions, and constant friction between men of depraved mind and depraved of the truth, who suppose that godliness is actually a means of gain. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. So again, this sets up what Paul is going to say about wealth and money in 1 Timothy 6 here by saying, look, there are these people that teach different doctrines. They don't actually understand anything. And a lot of these people believe that they are going to have great gain from teaching these doctrines. And there's a really great book on 1 Thessalonians. It might be on 1 and 2 Thessalonians. And I cannot remember the name of the book. It's in the basement right now. I'd have to go downstairs and take a look at it. But it's by a New Testament scholar named Abraham Malherbe, who's got a lot of great social scientific research. And he talks in those books about how in the Greco-Roman world there were kind of these like itinerant philosophers that would basically wander from town to town preaching their philosophy, and that there were many people that made a lot of money doing this. And he makes the point that it seems like, especially if you look at like 1 Corinthians and some other of the letters in the New Testament that deal with false teachers, that it seems like there are false teachers that are using the gospel in order just to try to make money. In other words, they're like these wandering philosophers who are proclaiming the gospel in order to make a buck. And Paul, I think, is addressing that problem in 1 Timothy right here. He's saying, look, like godliness is a means of gain, but we can't be like the false teachers who preach godliness in order to make money. That's not the point here. So he's going to go on. And I'm going to read verse 6 of chapter 6 through verse 10. Here's what he says. But godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some, by longing for it, have wandered away from the faith and pierced themselves with many griefs. Okay, so I completely agree, obviously, with every single word that Paul says here. Wanting to get rich does make people fall into many temptations and harmful desires, and that desire for wealth oftentimes ruins human beings. I completely agree with that. And I also completely agree with verse 10, which is one of the most famous verses on money in the entire Bible, that it's the love of money that is the root of all sorts of evil, and that there are a lot of people that have wandered away from the Christian faith because they are more concerned about making money than they are about putting their faith into practice. Completely agree with that. 100%. But none of this is incompatible with capitalism. And I think that there are a lot of socialists that read this and they say, oh, the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. And so then they jump to the conclusion that our politicians can then take money from productive people and give it to those who might not deserve it. Well, and again, we always have to remember that half of our tax dollars go to bomb innocent people around the world. That's just a fact, right? So, but there are these progressive Christians that already have this kind of because of their modern economic conceptions of how we ought to structure consumption and spending and all of that kind of stuff. When they read a passage like this, they immediately gloss it over with socialism and say, okay, so the love of money is the root of all kind of evil, which means that we need the government to control money more and more and more. Which is that's just not what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is that money makes people wonder, and when you love money, you can't fully love Christ, like Jesus says. You can't love both God and money. It's just not possible. You can't do both of those. The term he uses in the Gospels is wealth. You can't love God and also love your wealth too. Those things are incompatible. And if you go back to thinking about this within the context of what Paul says about the widows in chapter 5, then he's absolutely right. Like, individual Christians might be called to give up some of their money and give up some of their wealth, maybe even give up a large portion of their money and wealth to help those that are legitimately in need. And that if you refuse to do that, then you're putting the love of money before the love of other people. And you can't love from a pure heart. You cannot truly love in the sacrificial, cruciform manner that we are supposed to as Christians if you are hoarding money and if you put money before helping other people. Now, I will say, this is really interesting here, is that a lot of our government economic policies actually encourage this love of money, and they actually encourage being reckless with our money. So artificially low interest rates, this Federal Reserve policy that has been in place since the great crash of 2008, are one of those mechanisms by which people are encouraged to spend beyond their means. So the government comes in and sets interest rates, and therefore people, because the rates are lower, feel like they can go out and get an auto loan or a home loan on a vehicle or on a house that they would not have been able to afford otherwise. And so these artificially low interest rates actually encourage people to spend recklessly beyond their means. And then there is, of course, all of these industry-specific regulations and all of this industry-specific legislation that's designed to manipulate the prices of certain goods so that people will go out and purchase more of them. We don't have actual market rates of goods, and people don't have the ability to plan for their spending in the long run because no one really knows if the governments are going to change the regulations or change the interest rate. So it makes long-term economic planning almost impossible. And then, of course, we have our currency devaluation where the Federal Reserve just literally prints money out of thin air. And with COVID, with the CARES Act and the American Recovery Act and all of those things, they printed like nearly $5 trillion over the course of just a couple of years. And of course, what does currency devaluation do? If you have a bunch of money in a savings account, and then all of a sudden all this extra money is injected into the economy, then the purchasing power of that money that you're saving has decreased. And so what does that do? It incentivizes people to spend money when they might otherwise save it because the actual purchasing power of that money will be lower in the long run than it would have been had our currency not been artificially devalued, had the money supply not been artificially inflated. And so a lot of the problems that Paul is addressing here are actually created in the modern world by government policy regarding money and regarding economics. And that's something that I think people don't understand. And this is where we have to take our modern perspective out of this and just listen to what Paul is saying. Paul is correct. The love of money is a root of all sorts of evil. And we have to understand, too, that just because somebody goes and works for the government, that this doesn't take away the temptation to love money. It's interesting that all of these politicians that say that they love the poor and whatnot, they all wind up becoming multimillionaires when they're supposed to be serving the people. Very interesting here. So then Paul's going to follow this up. And this is, I think, a great passage to end on here. He spends a couple of passages talking about how Jesus is the actual Lord and that we have to give everything over to him, which I think frames the concluding sentences of this letter, and also is just a great way of summing up his argument. Like, in the end, we know that Jesus is the King, and it's that knowledge, that reality, that truth that is supposed to shape the way that we think about economics and shape the way that we think about helping other people. It's the fact that Jesus is Lord. And then Paul says this, couldn't think of a better way to sum up his arguments in 1 Timothy 5 and 6. He says, starting in 6:17, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. So Paul is not saying here that being rich is incompatible with being a Christian. He's not saying that at all. And in fact, the entire underlying logic of some people being rich means that maybe they were more productive than other people and they happen to have that wealth. But what has Paul said? If you happen to be rich, don't be conceited. Don't fix your hope on those riches. They can't provide you hope, but on God, because God richly supplies us with everything we need. And then he says this, instruct them to do good, the rich people, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future so that they might take hold of that which is life indeed. Again, what Paul is not saying here is the socialist argument that the government needs to come in and take all of this money from these rich people and give it to those that they think deserve it. That's not what Paul's advocating for here. Instead, what he's advocating for is for Timothy to bravely stand up to those that are wealthy and say, look, you've been given a lot. You cannot put your hope in what you have been given. You need to use your wealth to help other people. And again, how would that wealth be channeled? Exactly in the way that Paul advocates it in chapter 5. You find people that need it, and you give it to those people directly. And it's not somebody else taking from a third party and giving to someone that they seem fit. It's you as an individual Christian. If you have the means, it's your responsibility to give to those that are in need. It's not the government's responsibility. It's not the government's responsibility to step in and take money from third parties and just hand it out. No, if you happen to be fortunate enough to be wealthy, then you need to give that money over to those that need it the most. And that's Paul's logic here. And again, Paul is not advocating for free market capitalism. Paul does not think in contemporary post-Enlightenment economic categories. He just doesn't. He can't, because that's not the way that people thought about these concepts in the ancient world. But as I said at the very beginning of the show, I hope that with this review of chapter 5 and chapter 6, we've demonstrated that what we call socialism is incompatible with what Paul is saying in 1 Timothy 5 and 6, and that we can't just take these modern economic concepts and use them to gloss over what's actually being said. This is a really big challenge for a lot of us, because I really do believe that there are a lot of Christians, especially millennial Christians, people that are my age. There are a lot of millennial Christians that love the idea of helping the poor, but they don't want to actually do anything to help them themselves. They want other people to have to give up without voluntarily doing so their wealth in order to help people that they think deserve it. All of that's very idealistic. And I understand why people feel that way. Like, people want to feel like they're making a difference. They want to feel like they are helping those that are in need. But we have to be more wise in the way that we do this. And we have to make sure that we are not being reckless or careless in the way that we pursue charity. Again, going back to the principles that Paul outlines in 1 Timothy 5 and 6, we have an obligation to help those that are in need in the church. And we have an obligation to make sure that those that actually need it get the money or the resources, and then that those that don't are encouraged to go and figure things out on their own. Okay, there was a lot to cover there. There are several passages in the New Testament that deal with these issues that I want to go through over the next couple of months, and I really do hope that this helped you to think through 1 Timothy 5 and 6, both philosophically and historically, and then when it comes to practical economics. Again, my big picture argument here is that we can't import our modern conceptions of economics back into ancient texts, and that socialism just does not work as socialism just doesn't work as a model that we can derive from the Bible. And in fact, a lot of the passages that Christians who are kind of socialist or Keynesian oriented use to justify their contemporary political positions are not actually defensible on historical or economic grounds. And this is a great example of that. All right, guys. Well, I appreciate y'all listening to the end of the episode. As always, I went about 20 minutes longer than I was hoping to today. But I do hope that this cleared up a lot of issues here. I know that I threw a lot at you in a very short amount of time, but I'm hoping that this does help you think through everything. Again, thank you guys so much for listening to the end of this show. I really appreciate you guys supporting us, and I really appreciate you guys supporting me, and I look forward to having you back next week. We'll see you on Tuesday. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.